What if I said Squid Game wasn't just a movie? So let me tell you that during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, the South Korean government launched multiple self-sustenance campaigns with affiliated institutions, regulations, and apparatuses to promote a disciplined workforce while cleansing society of undesirable elements. In the decades after the Korean War, the demographic of Busan City expanded tremendously. People from the countryside came to the city to look for jobs in the emerging industrial sectors. Some of these newly arrived individuals, primarily those unable to find jobs and residence, were rounded up by the local police and sent to institutions like Brothers Home. After the Ministry of Health and Social Affairs introduced the Social Welfare Work Act in 1970, Brothers Home changed its legal status to a social welfare corporation, receiving large subsidies from the government. The substantive implications of Brothers Home's transformation towards a social welfare entity became directly evident in 1975 when the vagrancy directive was introduced under the government of Park Chung-hee. Park's regime lasted from 1963 until his assassination in 1979 and was characterized by a strong military rule, fierce anti-communism, and an intense focus on economic development. Point 7. The vagrancy directive targeted people considered vagrants or socially undesirable and aimed to regulate their movements and activities. It allowed authorities to detain and interrogate people suspected of being vagrants, and the punishment ranged from fines to forced labor. It was widely used to suppress dissent and maintain political control. The vagrancy directive was thus part of a broader context of increased state control and social policies aimed at regulating the movements and activities of specific individuals deemed to be superfluous. After Brothers Home changed its legal status to a social welfare corporation, the institution received state funding per capita, which meant there was a clear economic incentive to accommodate as many individuals as possible. These individuals encompass both the old and the young, and, in some instances, newborns. 8. There are countless accounts of how the institution's personnel and local law enforcement arrested and, in some cases, abducted individuals who appeared socially suspect for one reason or another. This categorization included criminals, vagrants, homeless individuals, orphans, prostitutes, alcoholics, violent individuals, senile people, undisciplined subjects, impoverished individuals incapable of self-sustenance, the disabled, and even random passers-by. In the early 1980s, Park In-gun, the proprietor and owner of Brothers Home, received commendation from the Chun Doo-hwan government for what was perceived as a remarkable initiative to alleviate homelessness and vagrancy in Busan. It was reported that Park had cleared the city's streets of homeless individuals and endowed those unfortunate individuals with valuable skills. This was predominantly manifested in the utilization of the inmates for the construction of numerous industrial structures and edifices within the complex. Subsequently, these individuals were given work within the facilities. Working with wood, metal, textiles, and other materials, the inmates produced shoes, pens, clothing, fishing tackle, and other products shipped abroad for profit. At its peak, Brothers Home had more than 20 factories. The government praised the initiative for purportedly equipping these marginalized individuals with diverse skills that would enable them to make a living after their release, a narrative propagated in a 1981 promotional video produced by Brothers Home. The reality, however, was very different. The institution epitomized a stark juxtaposition of public perception against the actual concealed operations, the egregious human rights violations and corruption within its confines. The camp, where the factories and residential buildings were located, was surrounded by walls and barbed wire and patrolled by guards armed with baseball bats and dogs. The institution's walls and propagandistic narratives concealed the realities within, while outwardly fulfilling a state-endorsed and financially supported objective of social sanitation. As witnesses later recounted, hardly any of these inmates were paid for their work. It was primarily forced labor. Brothers Home had very little success as a correctional facility aimed at helping inmates develop the skills necessary to support themselves upon release. Contrary to the proclaimed correctional or educational goals, The institution's primary objective seems to have been profit-oriented. Some observers have likened the facility to Park Ingen's personal kingdom, a stark contrast to the public image of a socially benevolent institution. The facility was a highly lucrative venture for Park and his family, generating millions of US dollars in revenue. This wealth was derived from embezzled governmental subsidies and the sale of products manufactured by the coerced labor of the inmates. Brothers' Home served as a nexus where various interests converged and found expression. From the state's perspective, the institution was pivotal in addressing society's undesirable elements, while for Park In-geun and his family, it provided a means to personal enrichment. The closure of the Brothers' Home facility in 1987 was precipitated by an investigation initiated by Ulsan District Prosecutor Kim Young-won at the beginning of that year. Upon discovering the appalling conditions within the institution, his office embarked on an inquiry that revealed rampant corruption and human rights violations. However, the investigation coincided with the intensification of the pro-democracy struggle. 12 fearing public outrage during an already tense political climate, the Chun Doo-hwan government exerted influence on the judicial and prosecutorial bodies to bury the case. Consequently, the case never underwent a comprehensive examination, and despite the prosecution advocating for a 15-year incarceration for Park In-geun, he was ultimately penalized with a considerably reduced sentence of 2.5 years for embezzlement. Notably, this conviction did not account for the human rights infringements perpetrated within the confines of Brothers' Home. 13. After operations at Brothers' Home were closed, some inmates were released, while approximately 700 were relocated to other facilities. While survivors of the facility had been striving to bring their experiences to light in the years following its closure, it was not until 2012 that the Brothers' Home case was reintroduced into public discourse. This resurgence was instigated by survivor Han Yong-seon, who staged a one-person protest before the National Assembly. Subsequently, the case began to attract serious attention from human rights activists, academics, legal professionals, researchers, politicians, and journalists. While the harrowing activities of Brothers' Home have been exposed to the most public scrutiny in recent times, it is critical to underscore that the existence of this institution was not an isolated phenomenon. Indeed, several similar institutions emerged and functioned under comparable circumstances during the same period, indicative of a broader systemic issue. One institution that deserves mention here was Seonggam Academy, Seonggam Hagwon, an orphanage / internment camp founded during the Japanese colonial era in 1942 on an island near Ansan, Gyeonggi Province, Korea, which continued operating until 1982. It is estimated that around 4,691 individuals were placed here during this period, although the number is likely much higher. These inmates did similar work to those in Brothers' Home, that is, forced labor in a prison-like institution. Witnesses report countless instances of abuse, torture, violence, malnutrition, rape, and drowning. In 2017, an exhumation revealed some 160 bodies buried in the area. The history of Seonggam Academy was included in the 2022 Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work to uncover the many human rights violations that reportedly occurred there. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded that the government was ultimately responsible for the Academy's existence and that its welfare operation was unconstitutional and illegal. An interesting detail is that Paik Gun-chil, a bureaucrat during the Japanese occupation, served as the director of Seonggam Academy during the 1940s. Subsequently, Paik established the International Adoption Organization known as Korea Social Service, KSS, in 1964. Although most of the crimes at Seonggam Academy documented in the 2022 Truth and Reconciliation Commission report happened in the 1960s and 1970s, decades after Paik Gun-chil was in charge, it highlights a relatively close relationship between a prominent international adoption organization like KSS and an institution like Seonggam Academy. It is possible that these internment camps, of which Seonggam and Brothers' Home may be extreme versions, were part of a more comprehensive network of child trafficking that in the most profitable cases led to international adoption, and in other cases, to children being detained in squalid and violent conditions, often indeterminately.